We've just a week to go now before we're live on stage with the new show, Cocaine Cowboys. Final tickets on sale from mcd.ie or venues. You know, this can be up to 20 odd gangland murders a year, gun murders, surrounding organised crime, but some of them do stand out, and usually it's when there's an innocent victim caught up in it. Every time there's a shooting, you'll have politicians and police coming out and saying that, you know, it was a miracle that nobody else was killed, even an attempted shooting. You know, there's been incidents where people have been shot while wheeling babies in buggies, when there's been drive-bys in highly populated areas, outside creches. Most recently, there was a shooting in a restaurant on Christmas Eve in Blanchardstown. But I think in 2007, when the gang boss Martin Marlo Hyland was killed, it was the murder of that young apprentice Anthony Campbell that really struck a chord on a national basis. And there was politicians stood on the dole. There was, you know, the kind of the usual demands for crackdowns on organised crime. And at the heart of it was this young, innocent trainee plumber, Anthony Campbell, whose mother, Christine, has spoken over the years about that loss. He was killed because he was almost collateral. He was there in that house that day when a hit team went in to kill Hyland. Hyland was asleep in a bed upstairs. One of the gunmen held Campbell possibly, you know, downstairs while the job was done on Hyland. And then a decision, it's always believed, was made that he could have been a witness, so he had to die too.
Yeah, I mean, it was really shocking, and it did have a huge impact, because sometimes there's certain crimes that bring home the reality of what is faced and what is involved in gangland crime. There's always been a sense of, well, if people are killing each other, if gangsters are killing other gangsters, it doesn't spark that same reaction. But I think everybody can relate to the idea of a very young man like Anthony Campbell doing an honest day's work, being brought into a situation that he had no involvement with. He was a young man, a decent guy. Nobody had a bad word to say about him before or after. And I think something like that brings it home, especially when the nature of the people involved. Marlo Hyland obviously was the real target that day. He was shot dead in his bed in the house that Anthony Campbell was working on. Marlo Hyland had become in that time probably the most infamous gangland criminal in the city. He had been responsible for a number of murders himself, or he was suspected of ordering them, and he was eventually taken out by his own friends, his own gang. And for a young man to be caught up in that kind of vicious and, you know, absolutely ruthless war, it really struck home. Obviously his mother as well spoke out, you know, publicly, which is very, very difficult to do, and she has continued to do so. You know, despite the obvious fear that most people have in that circumstance. And I think her testimony really made it very real to people who heard her speaking in the newspapers or on the radio or TV. So
Hyland was sort of loosely in charge of about 30 sort of criminals from the North Dublin area into Coolock, up to Dunshaughlin, you know, Walkinstown, Ballyfermot. He used another grouping called the Filthy 50, who were sort of young freelance hitmen, drivers, robbers, whatever. And he had grown huge and notorious and had become a top target of the Gardaí. They first set up an operation to crack down on gangland crime in general, and then realising how big his network had become, set up a separate operation to crack down on him. That had resulted in a huge amount of seizures, a huge amount of paranoia building within his grouping. He himself had become sort of gone a bit off the scale, because he was killing his own, believing them to be informers and touts. He, of course, had come to prominence and power because he took out his own boss in the years before that, PJ, the psycho judge, as he was known, who was the first big kind of, I think you could probably say, big sort of drug boss out that neck of the woods.
Yeah.
And Hyland had, you know, taken him out and was subsequently taken out by Eamon the Don Dunn, who took over the leadership and control of the gang. and who himself was taken out, killed some years later, having sort of gone into this crazy, murderous, paranoid frenzy in the aftermath of taking on, the boss role.
Yeah, I mean, Hyland and Eamon Dunn, who followed him, were clients of the Kinahans, really. The Kinahans at this point were based outside of Ireland, but that part of Finglas and their direct connection to these gangs made them, very important clients. And we saw that Eamon Dunn, before he was killed, he was at a boxing match hosted by the Kinahans. He had his associates there in the crowd. They were guests of honour, and so they had that direct supply. Marlo Hyland hit the big time at the same time. The drugs boom that we all talk about was happening around Ireland, both cocaine, ecstasy. He also had an ambition to kind of go nationwide. So he would have forged ties with, say, the Irwin clan in Sligo and other areas across up in County Louth. But the Eamon Dunn is believed to have ordered his execution, and he then was executed himself by the Kinahans directly at that point, because again, all the murders are bad for business.
So 2 men were quickly identified by Gardaí as being the killers, the hitmen who went to that house to take out Martin Marlo Hyland, but who also killed the innocent plumber Anthony Campbell. And one of them was on bail at the time and was subsequently named in court as one of the hitmen. That guy is a guy called John Mangan. And the reason we're talking about that, and we're going back to those terrible murders, in particular that of Anthony Campbell, is because John Mangan is finally coming up to his release date. He's been in prison since, we reckon, around 2007, 2008. He's serving sentences for both cannabis, is it?
Yeah, he's serving. He was caught in 2006 with £341,000 worth of cannabis. He was released on bail. Marlo Hyland was then murdered at the end of that year. And then in 2008, John Mangan received a 14-year prison sentence for possession of a handgun. He was ultimately named in court as one of the hitmen involved. However, he was never charged or prosecuted in relation to that, and has never publicly accepted that. However, he has those very, very serious convictions. He went into prison. During his time in prison, he was, I would say, not an ideal prisoner.
Oh, he's a chaotic kind of a character, isn't he?
He's a chaotic character. We heard loads of stories about him over the years. In particular, approaching people who the family of Marlo Hyland or his loved ones in various ways, and trying to speak to them about it and getting upset and all of this sort of weird, wild stuff. But I mean, he was in prison at that point, and he hit the headlines, I suppose, again in this underworld in 2022. I mean, he was due out, I think, in 2024 after a very, very long prison sentence. He only had a number of months to go, and yourself, as they come to the end of these prison sentences, they can even have a few other months knocked off them. Mm-hmm. So he was at that point, he'd served 14 years in prison, and he was on his way out.
It's a crazy thing to do, though. Locking house,
and
is, very.
So he was in locking house.
Easy. You can cook for yourself. Yeah. You can kind of, you can go out for a day. You can go for a walk. You can go down to the village and buy yourself a coffee. And anybody who does anything stupid in Loughlin House is just, people cannot understand them. But of course he did. He went on the run, and he ended up back in the main prison system.
He went back in the main prison. His cell was raided. There was allegations that he'd been using a phone, because they're actually allowed mobile phones, aren't they, in Loughlin House?
Yeah.
They're allowed a kind of a Nokia phone, isn't it?
And he was there was allegations that he was using that phone to make threats
against somebody who he was wrongly accused of owing him money, or like a lot of these guys, they have these imaginary debts in their head, and they're looking to collect them, whether they're justified or not. So there was threats going against innocent people. He then went on the run, was spotted driving crazily, and even though if he just kept his head down, he probably would have been out in 6 months. He got another another, I think it was an 18-month sentence. During his time in prison, in recent times, he's become paranoid, apparently. I mean, he's an older man at this stage. I don't know if you know his exact age there, but he's no spring chicken.
He's in his late 50s.
He's in his late, I think he's 58. But apparently he got paranoid in the last while, refusing to leave his cell at times. And yeah, it just shows you he's going to come out to a very different world than the world he went in on. At the time he went in, he would have been associated with Eamon Dunn, obviously. At that time, Eamon Dunn had this absolute reign of terror, it would be fair to say. I mean, people were really, really afraid of him, including very serious criminals. Eamon Dunn, in his time as, in his short time as the head of that drugs gang, I mean, it depends how you interpret these things, but it's something between 12 and 18 murders, including a range of people who were his friends, people like Graham McNally, who was shot dead in January 2009, Eamon Dunn's closest personal friend, shot dead on some sort of paranoid outburst. Well, who knows, I suppose. And then he had a concerted campaign to eliminate North Dublin from his rivals, people like Paul Farmer Martin, shot dead in August 2008. Other people like John Daly, who was, the famously phoned Liveline. He was taken out in a kind of a preemptive strike. John Paul Joyce, whose body was dumped near Dublin Airport in January 2010. So these are really, really, serious murders, going after serious criminals. And at the time John Mangan went into prison, Eamon Dunn was absolutely untouchable, or seemed to be. But he's coming out to a different world.
But to concentrate the mind for a minute on the Marlo Hyland, and more importantly, the Anthony Campbell murder.
Yeah.
Because that murder has never been solved.
Never been solved.
It's an open murder investigation. And Anthony Campbell's mother, Christine, who moved to England, I think some point in around 2010 or thereabouts, just probably not able to, deal with all the memories here. And you'd never get over the murder of your 20-year-old son in those circumstances, just never. But she, in the last year, and it's all to do with the release of John Mangan and the fact that nobody has been ever convicted of her son's murder. She was writing to the Garda Commissioner, and she was looking for the murder case and the murder investigation into her son to be handed over to the Garda's Serious Crime Review Team, or the Cold Case Team.
Yeah.
How can such a high-profile murder like that, the suspects are identified very early on in it. I mean, you look back and you look at we're able to talk amongst ourselves exactly who those early suspects were for that investigation. We know damn well, the Gardaí know damn well who they were looking at. And yet there was not enough evidence to ever bring them to court. I mean, you would imagine that this is a case, in particular the murder of Anthony Campbell, that warrants the Garda Cold Case Team's resources going in it. I don't know, would there be a bit of controversy if there was a suggestion that somebody like Marlo Hyland or his ilk, or a gangland, somebody who had embedded themselves in the gangland scene, that their murder was taking precedent over the others of innocence from the resources, the small enough resources of this Garda Serious Crime Review Team. But surely Anthony Campbell's murder should be there and should be a priority.
Yeah, absolutely. It should be. We don't know what's in that file. I mean, the Gardaí will have investigated, will have built up a file. All of that's confidential.
There's a lot of developments in DNA since 2006.
There is.
And I mean, there would have had to have been trace evidence left in that house. Those killers went through that house in Scribbleston Lane, was it?
Yeah, it was.
And they went up the stairs, and there was contact there. This wasn't a drive-by shooting with a burnt-out car.
No.
This was killers who entered a home. So, at the very least, you'd imagine that 17 years later, there should be enough there. And I'm presuming that the original Garda investigation, that the forensics went in there with a fine-tooth comb around that property. you'd imagine that there should be something there that could at the very least be retested at this stage.
Absolutely. And then, of course, there's gone back to witnesses who at the time may have been too afraid, or people that may have given information but weren't willing to make statements. With the passage of time and the demise of certain people, would they now be willing to have to speak about what they know about, I suppose? I mean, that's always what cold case investigations do, isn't it? They go back to people who may have known something, who may not have felt comfortable speaking at the time, who may now have a change of heart. Obviously, it was always said or rumoured, or whatever way you want to put it, that Eamon Dunn actually drove the getaway car. So, he's now dead. The fear that he would have held over some people, maybe that has passed, and maybe going back to them could be productive. This isn't people necessarily who were there on the day, but may have been aware of planning, logistics, cars, movements of guns, anything like that.
Because it was a big effort to kill him. I mean, he was at the time, Marlo Hyland, at that time, so paranoid. He was moving from house to house. Only a very tight circle of people would have known where he was at any particular point in time. He was convinced he was going to get killed, which he did. But just, on another note, I suppose, for the family of Anthony Campbell, while John Mangan has been named in court as the alleged hitman, he has denied, obviously, that. But nonetheless, we know he was an original suspect as well in the case. So because he isn't charged in connection with anything to do with it, or convicted with anything to do with it, Anthony Campbell's family have no access to the parole board to object to his being released.
Yeah.
He is there serving a sentence and is going to be released for cannabis supply and for possession of a gun. So there's no actual victim in either of those crimes. So there's no way a family has access to the parole board to object to him getting out. So it's kind of like it's very difficult for them.
It's very difficult. I mean, who did he even approach and on what level? But, you have to admire them. I always admire people like Anthony Campbell's mother, who, it's not easy to speak out publicly and to continue to do so. It takes a lot of courage, and it does have to be admired. I mean, it must
to keep up the fight for justice after that long, 17 years. I mean, every year, I suppose, anybody who loses a child will always have to look at others growing up and getting older. And I'm sure at this point of his life, had Anthony survived, he would have been 37, possibly had his own family now. She's missed out not only on her son becoming a properly rounded adult, I suppose, but she's also probably missed out on the opportunity of grandkids and all the rest. I mean, there's a huge effect. And, to keep speaking publicly, must, each time she does an interview, must, to an extent, make her relive it. But it is important that people, I believe, and I think it comes at a personal cost, but it is important that, people like her speak out and make the reality of it clear, that this isn't just, it isn't just, gangsters killing gangsters or something like that. There is terrible consequences for people on the sidelines. So Mangan is originally from Blanchardstown. There's no idea where he's going to go or what he's going to do when he gets out of prison.
No, I mean, he wouldn't be subject to, obviously if somebody is serving a life sentence, they're subject to this kind of constant monitoring. They can be brought back in at any time. But somebody like Mangan, when he finishes, he may have some sort of release conditions, but he's generally done and a free man to do what he wants. But we already know he's an erratic person, and if he's been erratic through all those prison terms, it's unlikely to change.
Yeah. Okay, Niall, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.